Welcome. In this video, I'm going to explain what a weighted average is. Let's say we've got a course, and in our course we have two tests, test 1 and test 2, and they are both weighted equally, meaning both of them are worth 50% of the total course. Now, let's say we get 80% on the first test and 50% on the second one. Our average is simply the average of those two numbers, or 65%. On that first test, we scored 80%. That test is worth 50% of the total marks. So of those 50 marks that were available, it meant that we received 40. The second test, also worth 50%, we scored 50% on the test, which means of the 50% that was available from that test, we got 25%. That's what the weighted average is. So the total weighted average is 65%. Or, if we were to take the average of these two, because their weights are even, it's simply taking the average of the two numbers. This makes sense, 65%. Now let's look at a different scenario. In this scenario, we've got 4 different assessments with different weights for each. And let's look at the first test, and let's say we get 60%. This means that of the 25% that was available from this test, we managed to score 60% of it, or 15% overall. Let's say we get 80% on the quiz. That means that because this quiz was worth 10% of our marks, or it's weighted for 10%, we managed to get 80% of those marks, or 8%. Let's say the assignment, we get 70%. Again, the assignment is worth 15% of the total marks for the semester. So we managed to get 70% of that, or 10.5. And test 2, let's say we got 50% on that. So of the 50% that this test is weighted, we managed to get half those marks, or 25%. And when we add all of the weighted averages up together, we get 59%. Now, if these were weighted equally, our average would have been 65. But test 2, for example, that's weighted heavily, brought the average down. Now let's look at the scenario where we've got a running total. So you write your first test and you get 80%. Now this means out of the 25% that this test was worth of our total marks, you managed to get 20% of it. That's your weighted average. But what's your running weighted average? Well, it's 80%, because basically this is the only assessment done so far. So far, that's what your mark is, 80%. Once we start doing more assessments, then the marks start to get combined. Let's look at the quiz. Let's say we got 45 on that. Of the 10% available on that quiz, we managed to get 4.5% of it. So what did that do to our running weighted average? Well, it brought it down, but it didn't bring it down significantly. I mean, 80 to 45, that's almost half as much, but we only went down 10%. Why is that? Well, because the quiz is only worth 10% of the total marks. So the test, which is weighted far heavier, gets to keep most of the marks. So that's why we had an 80 initially, then we go down to a 70. Now let's say we get a 90 on the assignment. The assignment is worth 15%. If we scored 90% on that assignment, it means we got 90% of those 15 marks, or 13.5. And now our running total went up, but didn't go up significantly because the assignment was only worth 15%. And the final test, if we did poorly on that, we scored 50% of the total marks that are available. So total marks were 50. We scored 50% of it, so we get 25%. And our running total ends up being a 63. Again, if these were all equally weighted, our average would have been 66. But because test 2 has a heavier weight, it brings the mark down a little bit more. So our overall average, our weighted average is 63%. And that's it.